Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. In this one I'm going to be talking about grids, in the context of grid-based movement and combat systems in TTRPGs. And yeah, as a bit of a summary, why do so many TTRPGs use gridded combat? Where does it all come from? We're going to be talking a bit about that. And basically, in a sort of Cliff Notes version, it's because grids are really simple and really quick and make the sort of mathematics and complexities of combat easier to handle. You know exactly where your targets are, you know exactly how much area your effects will fill, these kinds of things. But what's the problem with grids? And essentially it comes down to diagonals and circles. I don't know if this is something that bothers you, but it's something that does tend to bother me a little bit about gridded combat, is when I cast a big area of effect spell, like a fireball in D&D, or something else in another TTRPG system, what often happens is, because of the way they handle diagonals, your explosion will be, say it's a 10-foot radius. You've got your starting square here, you go out 5, 10, and you end up with an explosion that looks like this. Because in D&D, a diagonal movement is 5 feet, the same as a lateral movement, which naturally means this square here is the same distance from the origin as this one here. And so all of your big explosions come out as big squares, and all of your area of effects are squares. And similarly, it means if I'm a little archer over here, and I want to shoot at this person here, it's like a little furball creature, I don't know. But there's also a creature, let's put him here. It actually turns out that this guy is closer to me than this guy is. And again, to me, this kind of bothers me, and it's enough of a break from reality that it kind of ruins my immersion sometimes. So we're going to be talking about a solution to that. I don't know if it's a particularly novel solution. There are probably other systems that have come up with this themselves, but I haven't seen this anywhere. So if you're just interested in that solution, I will put the timecode on screen that you can jump to, and it will be explained what at least my solution to this issue is. If you are interested in some of the backgrounds and the history of gridded combat systems, I'm going to be talking a bit about that, why we use them, what are they good for, and some other options for like hexes and triangles and stuff like that. So yeah, let's crack on. So a bit of the history. I'll actually start with the second bullet point there. There is not a lot of history. There is very, very few resources online that I could find about the history of gridded movement systems and where they came from. So, you know, if you're a historian, please go and study this, because I think there's quite a lot of interesting history to uncover here. So yeah, as most people know, D&D, as sort of the original TTRPG, came out of the wargaming scene. It's sort of where wargaming instead started focusing on individual characters in the army, as opposed to big troops of units. And as that sort of focus became smaller on an individual, the size of your combats became smaller, and also the locations of combat became smaller. You went from the big open fields into the dungeons. At that time, gridded movement sort of came about as a way to handle where people were in combat and those kinds of tactical elements. And essentially the grid is an abstraction, right? It's a simplification of the real world. It says you can only be on position 1 or position 2. You can't be at 1.5. You either have to be here or there. Which obviously isn't realistic, but it's a nice abstraction. It simplifies the game so that you can know exactly where people are. And the reason I think that abstraction came about, and again this is my speculation because there's very little research on the topic, is when the wargaming became a TTRPG, the focus was much less on sort of trying to simulate warfare. It wasn't trying to be as realistic anymore. It was just trying to tell a story, a personal story about your characters and their quest into the dungeon. And for those kinds of stories, you kind of need to get rid of some of the realism. You need to simplify the mechanics of the world, because you don't need to know about the projectile arcs of your arrows. You just need to know, are they within range or not? When you think about movies or books, how many movies and books spend time on your action hero taking 15 minutes to just pop to the toilet? It's not a good story. It's a level of realism that you just don't need. Do you know what I mean? Okay, I'm rambling. Again, that's kind of the point of these unscripted videos. So yeah, that's kind of why I think the grid came about. And if you think about chess as sort of, I think chess might be the oldest example of gridded combat. Chess is a massive abstraction of warfare. Here is an abstracted view of a battlefield. Here are some abstracted troops that you might have. How can I position my troops to best cover my defenses and make a good attack against their targets? And then the final bit of history, the only other bit of gridded history that I could really find anything about, was where 5-foot squares came from. And as far as I can tell, they were originally a D&D thing. Lots of other TTRPGs that follow sort of used that as a good standard. And I think 5-foot squares are used because 5 is a nice countable number. Often people are quite good at counting in 5s. 5, 10, 15, you know. People have 5 fingers on a hand, that kind of thing. And then 5 feet as a unit of measurement is a pretty good unit for the scale of combat that individual people would be having. Yeah, it is about how far you could swing a sword. I have noticed that a lot of modern TTRPGs are moving away from using 5s as their sort of base unit, and instead of going to 1. And this is a policy actually I'm quite in favour of. Personally, I think that 1 meter, if you want to put a unit to it, is quite good. But really, the gridded combat is already an abstraction, so we can just call it 1 grid, you know. It's just 1 grid square. And actually that allows the scale of your battles to change to suit the setting, which is quite nice. Anyway, that's all I have on the history. I have talked about it a little bit, but why do we use grids? It comes down to this thing of, it's an abstraction of reality. If I'm here, I'm in this little grid square here, and there's a wall here, and there's a massive thing of fire here, burning fire, and I know that there are some monsters over on this side. I know that I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, they're about 8 squares away from me, so they can't quite get to me on this turn. But you know, maybe on their next turn they'll reach me. That kind of thing. It's countable. It allows you to track positions. I know that this creature, they aren't sort of off to a side there. They are actually in that square precisely. That is where they occupy, for certain. And it means that when I'm presented with this battlefield, I can assess it quickly. I can say, okay, there's fire here, so I know that I can't. I'm gonna have to go around this way if I want to attack them. I can't go around this way without going through fire. There's no like gap here because the fire. Again, everything perfectly fills a grid square. There's no way past. That kind of thing. And then it allows for tactics. When I finally make it round to fight these monsters, an ally of mine could come right here, and then I know for certain that we are flanking. Those kinds of things. So that's kind of why we use grids and what they're good for. Some of you might be saying, okay, but there are other shapes, aren't there? So why do we use squares? So the other kind of 2 options, because there are only 3 regular polygons which tile the plane, the square, the triangle, and the hexagon. So why don't we use triangles or hexagons? And actually, often we do. We use hexagons, and we often use them for overland travel, like long distances. You can draw your world map. You can have like some mountain range over here, and then you can have a river like this, and you can have some settlement there and a settlement here, and some road between them, right? And often we'll track long distance movement over hexes. And hexes and triangles both have the advantage that you don't really have issues around diagonals. You know, if I'm going from this grid hex to this hex, it's 1 movement. If I'm going from here to here, it's another movement. So the same can be said for like triangles. You do sometimes have systems which allow for diagonal movement like this, sort of across the line of a hex, but saying that that's 2 units is actually mathematically quite close to reality. Similarly, with triangles, you can say that those are all 1s, those are all 1s, and if you wanted to go to like this grid square, yeah, 2 is a pretty good guess. So actually the maths of it doesn't break too much. So why don't we use hexes and triangles for our combats? And I think it comes down to 2 things. Firstly, and probably the less important thing, is 3-dimensional stuff. Generally, I think interesting combats involve some element of elevation. I think it's always fun when you can have a big pit to throw your creatures into, like a big pit. Or you might have a bridge overlooking, like a little rope bridge overlooking the battlefield. So there are some people down here and some people up here, and then you can cut the bridge and people fall and that kind of stuff. I think that is always an element of combat that should be brought in. And fundamentally, when you go into a 3rd dimension with triangles and hexes, your shape changes. So you have to end up doing like a hexagonal prism. This is going to be terrible drawing, but something like that, right? And that means that while you have this nice unit movement for when you're going normally, as soon as you start going diagonally, vertically, your distances get all confused. And the same for triangles. So that's the reason 1. And reason 2 is if you're doing combats at the scale of individual people, it quite often means you're going to have buildings, you're going to have dungeon walls, you're going to have structures. And often structures are built, in straight lines. And you can kind of make it work with a hex grid, but eventually you're going to have this scenario where like a wall goes through half a hex, and then like, okay, so can I stand here? Or am I in the wall there? Like, how's that going to work? Obviously, for like natural formations or like out in the open, hexes and triangles probably work quite well. But whenever you're in a dungeon or in a building, or even if there's just like some ruined walls, the hexes tend to make those kinds of things awkward. So I think those are the 2 reasons why typically we don't use triangles and hexes for combat. Okie dokie. So it's the moment you've all been waiting for. What is my solution? What I think is the fix to gridded combat? How can we make it work? And this is the fix right here. Essentially, you use 1 unit for steps horizontally, or just like from one square to the neighbouring square. So this step here would be 1. That is terrible writing. Let's try that again. So that's 1. And use 1.5 for any diagonals. So this would be 1.5, and another 1.5 would be 3. So for total, if you were going from here to here, it would be 4 steps. Alternatively, if you don't like using halves, you think people are going to struggle counting in halves, you can just times everything by 10. And so a single square would be 10, and 2 diagonals in this case would be 30. Again, it's up to you. I think using 1 as your base unit is quite convenient for a lot of things, but as an option you can just times everything by 10. And yeah, as a little bonus, if you want to think about 3D movement, like into the vertical direction, you can treat it as 2. So if I just zoom back in, you can have a look at this little diagram. So here we have a step from one square to the neighbouring square, or sort of cube to cube, and it's 1 meter in this case, 1 unit. If you're going diagonally horizontally, it's 1.5. Same if you're going diagonally vertically, it's 1.5. And if you're going sort of diagonally corner to corner of 2 cubes, you can count that as 2. And from a mathematical perspective, this is really pretty close to reality. I have here that, at worst, it is 10% error from the real distance, which is pretty good going compared to D&D's method, which at worst has a 40% error in its diagonal measurements. Of course, if this might in some circumstances be a bit complicated to count, so as a bit of a trick for it. So if you were doing this diagonal, this movement here, you could go, rather than doing 1 diagonal, 2 diagonal, 1 straight, you can instead count it as 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 4. Essentially do your longest direction first and count them as ones, and then do your shortest direction second and count them as halves. And that will sum to the same thing. So that's quite a nice trick for doing movement, assuming you have no obstacles in the way. It can be a nice way of counting out distances. And just as a demonstration that this really does fix the way circles look, here are some circles that are made with this system. So this circle here is a radius of 2, so it goes 1, 2. And as you can see, it is actually quite square, but at this kind of size, you can't really get a better circle than that. It's going to be a square one way or the other. This is a radius of 3, and you can see we're looking pretty good now. That looks pretty circular. Again, 1, 2, 3. And then this is a radius of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And yeah, this looks really pretty damn circular. Now, the last thing to say, of course, is anyone who's plays Pathfinder might know a similar system is used in Pathfinder. In Pathfinder, the way it works is every second diagonal that you take is double the normal, which is 1. So in this case, Pathfinder would count this as, that would be 1, or 5 feet. Then the second diagonal would be 2, and then this straight would be 1. So they would get 4 for that as well. But I think it's better to have a consistent unit for what your diagonal size is. And I think counting in 1.5 is easier than counting 5, 15, 20, 30. Like, you have to keep alternating between steps of 5 and steps of 10. I think this is an easier system. But as I say, I don't know if this is a novel idea. If you know of a TTRPG that uses a system like this, I'd be really interested to know about it. Again, if you have any other comments, please leave them below. And yeah, we get a discussion going about how we might make gridded combat even better. So yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and consider subscribing. Our video will be coming out hopefully in the next week or so about how the movement system in my TTRPG works. Essentially it's this, but I'll give a bit more detail about how movement speed and long distance travel and moving backwards and difficult terrain and those kinds of things. So yeah, look out for that in the next few days. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.